My name is Kayla Thomas. I am 27 years old. Until the day I was rushed into emergency surgery, I believed I understood what family meant. I thought family meant staying when things became inconvenient. I thought it meant choosing each other when there were no good options left. I was wrong, and I learned that lesson while lying flat on my back, staring at hospital lights, listening to my parents decide that a party mattered more than whether I lived or died. The pain started that morning as something small, the kind of discomfort you brush off because you have errands to run and a job that does not care how you feel. It felt like pressure low in my abdomen, tight and annoying, nothing dramatic. I told myself I would deal with it later. Within an hour, the pressure sharpened into something violent. Every breath felt like it scraped against something torn inside me. I dropped my keys twice before I made it to the kitchen counter. By the time I slid down onto the cold tile floor, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I called for an ambulance because there was no one else to call. When the paramedics arrived, their voices were calm in that professional way that somehow made everything feel worse. They asked my name, my age, if I had family nearby. I nodded and said yes because I still believed that mattered. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and pain that came in waves, each one stealing more air from my lungs. I remember thinking that this was the moment people talk about, the moment when family drops everything and shows up. By the time they wheeled me through the emergency room doors, sweat soaked through my shirt, and my vision kept fading in and out. A nurse leaned close and told me they had contacted my parents. I held on to that sentence like a lifeline. I pictured my mother pacing the waiting room, my father demanding answers. I needed that image to survive the next few minutes. They moved fast after that. Blood work, imaging, a doctor explaining something about internal bleeding, and the word surgery spoken too quickly, too casually, like it was not about to split my life in half. I was transferred to a pre-operative room separated from the hallway by a thin curtain that did nothing to block sound. My phone buzzed once with a message from my mother asking what hospital I was at. I typed back with fingers that felt numb, telling her where I was and that they were taking me into surgery. I waited for the follow-up question. Are you scared? Do you need us? We are on our way. None of those messages came. Instead, as a nurse adjusted my IV and asked me to confirm my name and date of birth, I heard my mother's voice from the other side of the curtain. It was calm, too calm. She was not talking to me. She was talking to my father and my older brother. "Let's go," she said, like she was announcing it was time to leave a restaurant. "She will be fine. They said it was routine. We are already late." There was a pause, the sound of someone laughing softly, and then the scrape of chairs moving. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt more than whatever was happening inside my body. I tried to speak, to call out, but my throat closed around the words. The nurse glanced at the curtain, then back at me, her expression shifting into something careful. She asked quietly if my family was staying. I shook my head, once a small movement that felt heavier than anything I had ever done. As the footsteps faded down the hallway, something inside me went very still. I realized in that moment that my parents had made a choice. They had heard the word surgery and weighed it against cake music and appearances, and they had decided I was not urgent enough to disrupt their evening. The nurse took a breath and asked the question that changed everything. "If something goes wrong," she said gently, "who has medical decision-making authority for you?" I stared at her, confused at first, then terrified. I told her my mother's name automatically because that was how it had always been. She nodded and handed me a clipboard. "This is the consent form," she said, "and this is your medical power of attorney. You need to sign before we can proceed." My hands trembled as I took the pen. Somewhere down the hall, my parents were getting into their car. Somewhere else entirely, I was being asked to legally trust the people who had just walked away from me. As I signed my name, a single thought cut through the pain and fear with startling clarity. If I died tonight, they would say they thought I would be fine, and the law would believe them. The moment after I signed the consent form felt unreal, like I had stepped outside my own body and was watching someone else live my life. The nurse clipped the paperwork to my chart and told me she would be right back. The curtain fluttered as she stepped out, leaving me alone with the low hum of machines and the sharp smell of antiseptic. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying my mother's voice over and over in my head. She will be fine. The words sounded harmless, even reasonable if you did not hear them from a hospital hallway while your daughter was being prepped for emergency surgery. I told myself they did not mean it the way it felt. I told myself they were scared and did not know how to handle it. That was always my job, to translate their absence into something that hurt less. As a child, I learned early that disappointment was easier to swallow if you made excuses for the people who caused it. I had spent my entire life doing that work for them. I lay there doing it again, convincing myself this was just another misunderstanding, another moment I would smooth over later. The pain in my abdomen pulsed in slow, angry waves, each one reminding me that later was not guaranteed. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. "Let us know how it goes." That was it. No question mark, no offer to come back. I stared at the screen, waiting for the follow-up message that never came. I typed a response, erased, it typed again, erased it again. In the end, I did nothing. A memory surfaced without warning, sharp and unwelcome. I was 16, standing on a cracked soccer field after a game, scanning the empty bleachers, while the other girls ran into their parents' arms. My coach had clapped me on the shoulder and said I was tough, that I did not need anyone cheering me on. I had smiled then too. Being strong had always been my role. It was the compliment they used when they did not want to show up. The curtain shifted again and a different nurse stepped in, older, with tired eyes that had seen too much. She checked my vitals and asked if I was comfortable. I almost laughed at that word. Comfortable was not possible anymore. She paused, then asked if anyone would be waiting for me when I woke up. The question landed hard. I hesitated just long enough to tell the truth. "I do not think so," I said. Her mouth tightened in a way that told me she understood more than she said out loud. She nodded and told me they would take good care of me. I believed her. Strangers had already done more for me that day than my own parents. As they adjusted the bed and prepared to move me, I thought about my older brother Mark and how different this would have been if he were the one lying here. Mark was 32, married, with a steady job my parents liked to brag about. When Mark twisted his ankle at a company picnic years ago, my parents left early to drive him to urgent care, even though he insisted he was fine. They had hovered then, annoyed at him for downplaying it, angry at the idea that something could happen to him without them present. I had watched that scene from the back seat, invisible and silent. I wondered if my mother would have said she will be fine if it were him behind this curtain. I knew the answer, and knowing it hurt more than the physical pain. The bed started moving, the wheels rattling softly as they pushed me down the hallway. The ceiling lights passed overhead in a steady rhythm, each one blurring into the next. I felt small, reduced to paperwork and symptoms and a problem to be solved. Somewhere deep down, another thought began to form, quiet but persistent. If my parents were not here now, they did not get to pretend later that they had been. I did not know yet what that meant, or what I would do with it, but the idea settled into me like a seed. As they stopped outside the operating room and asked me to confirm my name one last time, I realized something else just as important. I had trusted my parents by default for 27 years without ever asking whether they deserved that trust. Lying there alone and scared, I understood that trust, like consent, could be taken back. And whatever happened next, this moment would be the last time I let anyone tell me that being strong meant being left behind. They parked my bed outside the operating room and told me they were waiting on the anesthesiologist. The hallway was colder here, quieter, stripped of the rushed chaos of the emergency department. I could hear the faint clatter of metal trays and the murmur of voices behind closed doors. Time stretched in a strange way, every second heavy and deliberate. My phone rested on my chest face down like it was ashamed to look at me. I knew if I turned it over, I would find nothing new. No apology. No sudden change of heart. Still, my hand drifted toward it anyway, as if muscle memory could summon the parents I needed instead of the ones I had. The anesthesiologist arrived and introduced herself, explaining the procedure in careful, practiced sentences. She asked if I had questions. I wanted to ask if people usually went into surgery alone. I wanted to ask if anyone had ever changed their mind at the last second and come running down the hallway. Instead, I nodded and said I understood. When she asked again about my medical power of attorney, I gave my mother's name, and the words tasted bitter in my mouth. She marked it down without comment. A nurse adjusted the blanket over my legs and squeezed my hand briefly, a small human gesture that nearly broke me. As they prepared the medications, the hallway filled with footsteps again. For one reckless second, hope flared in my chest. I turned my head toward the sound, my heart racing. It was not my parents. It was a group of guests in dress clothes passing by on their way out, laughing softly, talking about traffic and parking. The contrast hit me hard. Somewhere nearby, people were celebrating while I waited to be cut open. My phone buzzed once more, and this time I looked. A photo loaded slowly on the screen, my mother standing beside my father and brother, all of them smiling under string lights. The caption read, "Family time before the party gets crazy." My hands went cold. They had already left the hospital. They had already decided the story they would tell themselves about this night. The nurse noticed my expression and asked if everything was okay. I swallowed and nodded again because that was what I had always done. Say, "I am okay." Make it easier. The anesthesiologist returned and told me it was time. As they began to wheel me forward, a sudden fierce clarity cut through the fear. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not poor communication or bad timing. This was a pattern one that had finally reached a moment where it could no longer be ignored or excused. My parents had chosen what was comfortable and visible over what was right, and they had done it without hesitation. The operating room doors swung open, and the bright lights inside made me squint. They moved my bed into position, the room filling with purposeful motion. Someone placed a mask over my face and told me to take slow, deep breaths. As the medication began to pull me under, my thoughts narrowed to a single, searing realization. The people who were supposed to protect me had walked away, and I had given them legal permission to decide my fate anyway. If I woke up, I would have to live with that. If I did not, they would live with a story that painted them as concerned parents who believed their daughter would be fine. The unfairness of it burned hotter than fear. My last clear thought before everything went dark was not about pain or death. It was about responsibility, about how easily they had accepted the role of decision-makers without accepting the responsibility to stay, and about how if I survived this, I would never again confuse biology with loyalty or silence with strength. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the sound. A steady electronic beeping, slow and insistent like a clock measuring something far more important than time. My throat burned dry and raw, and my abdomen throbbed with a deep, aching pain that felt heavier than before, as if something fundamental inside me had been rearranged. I tried to move and immediately regretted it. My body responded with a sharp warning, and I let out a small sound I did not recognize as my own. A nurse appeared at my side almost instantly, her face coming into focus as she spoke my name. "Kayla, you are in recovery. Surgery is over. You are safe. Safe." The word sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. My eyes drifted around the room, taking in the pale walls, the curtain half drawn, the empty chair pushed neatly against the corner. No jacket draped over it, no purse on the floor. No familiar figure leaning forward waiting for me to open my eyes. The nurse adjusted my IV and asked how I was feeling. I croaked out that my throat hurt. She offered me ice chips and told me to take it slow. What I wanted to ask was whether my parents were here, but the question stayed lodged in my chest. I already knew the answer, and saying it out loud felt like pressing on a bruise. As the fog in my head began to lift, memory rushed back in fragments. The hallway, the curtain, my mother's voice saying she would be fine, the operating room lights. A wave of emotion followed so sudden and intense, it made my chest tighten. It was not just fear or sadness, it was humiliation. I had gone into surgery alone, while the people who raised me chose to be somewhere else, and now I was waking up the same way. The nurse stepped away to check my chart, and I turned my head slowly, scanning the room again, just in case. Still empty. I felt a hot sting behind my eyes and blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Crying felt pointless. I had cried before in smaller moments that had never changed anything. My phone sat on the tray beside the bed. I stared at it for a long moment, afraid of what I would see and more afraid of seeing nothing at all. With careful fingers, I picked it up. The screen lit up immediately, crowded with notifications. Messages, missed calls, group chats. For a split second, hope flared again, bright and foolish. Maybe they were outside. Maybe something had happened after I went under. I opened the first message. It was not, "Are you awake?" or "We are here." It was a photo. Balloons. A cake. My parents and my brother standing close together, glasses raised, smiling at the camera. The caption read, "So glad we could all make it." My stomach twisted, and not from surgery. I scrolled. Another photo. A short video of laughter, someone shouting over music, my mother's voice clear and cheerful in the background. "She will be fine," she said again, like a refrain. They always say that in hospitals. The nurse returned and noticed my expression. "Do you want me to call someone for you?" she asked gently. I shook my head. The truth was not that I did not need anyone. It was that I did not want to call people who had already decided I was optional. She nodded understanding in her eyes and told me she would be nearby. After she left, the weight of what had happened settled fully onto me. This was not a single bad night. It was the clearest version of a story I had been living my entire life. Being left out. Being expected to handle it. Being told I was strong so no one else had to be. Lying there with stitches in my body and an empty chair beside my bed, I felt something shift. The excuses I had always made for my parents began to fall apart under the harsh light of reality. They had not stayed because they did not want to be inconvenienced, and they had trusted that I would survive without them, just as I always had. My phone buzzed again this time with a message from my mother. How did it go? No punctuation, no urgency. I stared at the words until they blurred. In that moment, a decision formed quietly but firmly. I was done answering questions that came too late. I was done making their choices easier by pretending I did not feel the consequences. The beeping of the monitor continued steady and indifferent. For the first time since I had arrived at the hospital, I felt fully awake, fully present. Alone, yes, but clear. Whatever came next would not be about punishing them. It would be about protecting myself, even if that meant letting the truth make people uncomfortable. The hours after surgery passed slowly, measured in medication schedules and vital checks, but my mind refused to rest. Every time the pain medication dulled the ache in my body, the memories sharpened instead. I closed my eyes and scenes from my childhood rose uninvited, lining up neatly as if they had been waiting for permission. I remembered being 8 years old, standing in the kitchen with a scraped knee after falling off my bike. My mother had sighed, handed me a paper towel, and told me to stop crying because I was making a mess. My father had looked up from the television long enough to say that girls who cried over small things would never survive the real world. I learned then that pain was something to handle quietly. Years later, when I was 14 and came home shaking after a boy at school shoved me against a locker, my mother told me not to make a big deal out of it. She said boys could be rough and that I should be grateful it meant he noticed me. My father added that I needed to toughen up. That was the first time I felt my stomach knot in that familiar way, the same way it had knotted the morning I collapsed on my kitchen floor. I pushed those memories aside for years, convincing myself they were harmless misunderstandings, products of a different generation. Everyone's family had flaws. That was the story I told myself. The monitor beeped steadily beside me, pulling me back to the present. I shifted slightly and winced the pain, reminding me that this was not a memory. This was real. A nurse came in to check my incision and asked if I had support at home for when I was discharged. The question caught me off guard. Support. I hesitated, then said I had a friend who could help. The nurse nodded approvingly, making a note on her chart. It was such a small exchange, but it underscored something I could no longer ignore. Even strangers were planning for my care in ways my own parents had not. My phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from my brother Mark. "Glad you made it through. Mom said it was routine anyway." The words landed like a slap. Routine. As if being cut open and stitched back together were just another item on a busy schedule. I typed a reply and erased it. I wanted to ask him if he would have gone to the party if it were his wife on that operating table. I wanted to ask him if he remembered how our parents had canceled plans for days when he was sick as a child. Instead, I set the phone down. Engaging would only invite the same dismissive explanations I had heard my whole life. Another memory surfaced, this one harder to shake. I was 19, home from college for the summer, working 2 jobs to save money. One night, my father had come home drunk and angry about something I never fully understood. When I tried to leave the room, he grabbed my arm too hard, his fingers digging in as he told me not to walk away when he was speaking. My mother had watched from the doorway, saying nothing, her face tight with irritation rather than concern. The next morning, she told me I should not provoke him and that I knew how he got when he was stressed. I learned then that keeping the peace mattered more than my safety. Lying in the hospital bed now, the bruise from that night seemed to pulse in my memory alongside the fresh pain in my abdomen. The pattern was impossible to deny. Whenever I was hurt, the responsibility shifted to me. Be quieter, be stronger. Do not make this harder for us. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, feeling something harden inside my chest. This surgery had not created the problem. It had simply exposed it. My parents leaving for a party was not an isolated cruelty. It was the natural conclusion of years of neglect wrapped in the language of toughness and practicality. The nurse returned with medication and asked if my pain was manageable. I told her it was because it was easier than explaining the truth. As she worked, she mentioned casually that my medical power of attorney was listed as my mother and asked if that was still correct. The question echoed in my head long after she left. Was it correct to trust someone who had already shown me exactly how much I mattered when things became difficult? The answer came with surprising clarity. No. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel angry without immediately burying it under excuses. The anger was not explosive. It was steady grounding, like something solid I could stand on. I reached for my phone again, not to respond to messages, but to scroll through my contacts. I stopped on Lisa's name, my best friend since college, the one person who had texted me before surgery asking if I was scared. She was the only one who had treated this like what it was, an emergency. My thumb hovered over the screen as another realization settled in. Being strong had never protected me. It had only made it easier for others to step away. As I lay there, stitched and exhausted, I understood that if I did not change something now, this would not be the last time I woke up alone after someone else decided I would be fine. By the next morning, the hospital room felt less like a place of healing and more like a quiet courtroom where the evidence of my life was laid out in plain sight. Sunlight crept in through the narrow window, illuminating the empty chair beside my bed. I watched dust drift through the beam of light and wondered how something so ordinary could feel so accusatory. My body ached, but the sharper pain came from the clarity settling in. I could no longer pretend this was about bad timing or misunderstanding. This was about value, about who mattered when choices had to be made. A nurse came in with my breakfast tray and helped me sit up. She asked how I slept and whether anyone had visited overnight. I told her no. She did not look surprised. She simply nodded and said that my friend Lisa had called early to check on me. Hearing Lisa's name sent a small wave of relief through me. Someone had noticed my absence without being asked. As the nurse left, I picked at the food without much appetite, my thoughts drifting again to my family. My mother finally called mid-morning. Her voice was bright, almost cheerful, as if she were calling from the grocery store instead of the aftermath of my surgery. She asked how I was feeling and said she hoped I was not being dramatic about everything. She reminded me that the party had been important, that appearances mattered, that people would have talked if they had left early. I listened in silence, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles hurt. When she paused, waiting for reassurance, I realized something crucial. She was not calling to apologize. She was calling to be soothed, to be told she had done nothing wrong. I told her I needed to rest and ended the call. The quiet that followed felt heavy but honest. A few minutes later, my father texted to say they would stop by later if they had time. If they had time. The words echoed in my head as I set the phone down. I thought about the unspoken rules in our house growing up. Mark's needs came first. His problems were discussed openly, dissected, solved as a family. Mine were handled privately, if at all. When Mark got into trouble, it was stress. When I struggled, it was weakness. I was praised for being low maintenance, for not needing much, for figuring things out on my own. I saw now how that praise had shaped me into someone easy to leave behind. Being the strong one had been a role assigned to me, not a trait I had chosen. The doctor came in to check my incision and discuss recovery. He explained the risks, the follow-up appointments, the importance of having someone authorized to make decisions if complications arose. He glanced at my chart and asked if my medical power of attorney was up to date. The question landed with unexpected weight. I hesitated, then told him I was considering a change. He nodded without judgment and said that was entirely my right. Hearing a professional state it so plainly felt empowering. For years, my family had acted as if loyalty was automatic, as if questioning them was betrayal. Here was someone telling me that consent was something I controlled. After he left, I lay back and closed my eyes, replaying the sound of my mother's voice in the hallway. "Let's go. She will be fine." That sentence no longer sounded neutral. It sounded dismissive. It sounded final. I realized that my parents had not just left physically. They had left emotionally long before this surgery, retreating into a version of family that worked for them and required nothing from them. The difference now was that I could no longer ignore the cost. My phone buzzed again this time with a message from an aunt asking if the rumors were true, if I had really gone into surgery alone. The fact that the story was spreading told me something else. Silence had protected my parents for years. Speaking up, even unintentionally, had already begun to shift the balance. I stared at the message, then set the phone aside without replying. I was not ready to explain myself yet. I needed to decide what I was willing to accept going forward. Lying there, surrounded by the quiet competence of nurses and doctors, I felt a strange sense of resolve take shape. I could not change what my parents had done, but I could change the access they had to me. This was not about revenge, it was about responsibility. If I did nothing, the message would be clear. They could walk away again, and I would still hand them control when it mattered most. I took a slow breath, feeling the pull of my stitches, and let the thought settle fully. That was not strength. That was surrender, and I was done confusing the two. The decision did not arrive with fireworks or anger. It came quietly, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. Later that afternoon, a nurse returned with a clipboard and a calm, practiced expression. She explained that before I could be transferred to a regular room, they needed to review my paperwork again. Consent forms, emergency contacts, medical decision authority. She spoke slowly, giving me space to ask questions, but I already knew what I needed to hear. She pointed to the section listing my medical power of attorney and read my mother's name out loud, then asked if that information was still correct. The room felt suddenly smaller. I thought of my mother's voice in the hallway, the way she had said she would be fine, as if she were commenting on the weather. I thought of the empty chair beside my bed and the photos from the party still burned into my memory. I asked the nurse what my options were. She did not hesitate. She explained that I could change it at any time, that it was my legal right, that it happened more often than people realized. Her tone was neutral, factual, free of judgment. That mattered more than she knew. For the first time, someone was not asking me to protect my parents' feelings. They were asking me to protect myself. She handed me a new set of forms and a pen. I stared at the blank lines, my name printed neatly at the top, waiting for my signature. My hand trembled, not from pain this time, but from the weight of what I was about to do. Changing this meant admitting something I had avoided my entire life. It meant acknowledging that the people who were supposed to act in my best interest had already chosen not to. I closed my eyes and pictured Lisa, my best friend, sitting in the cramped apartment where she had always made room for me on her couch, no questions asked. I remembered the text she had sent before my surgery, asking if I was scared, the only person who had asked. When I opened my eyes, the decision felt inevitable. I wrote Lisa's name carefully, letter by letter, in the space where my mother's had been. The nurse watched quietly, then nodded and took the clipboard when I was done. She told me she would update my chart immediately. The finality of it settled over me in a way that was both terrifying and relieving. Somewhere in the hospital system, my parents' authority over my body had just been erased. They did not know it yet. I lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding. I was not celebrating. I was grieving. Grieving the version of family I had pretended to have, the one that showed up when it counted. But beneath that grief was something steadier. Control. I had reclaimed a small but critical piece of my life. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with another message from my mother asking when visiting hours were and whether she should bring anything. I looked at the screen and felt a strange calm wash over me. For the first time, the question did not hold power over me. Whether she came or not no longer determined my safety. I set the phone face down without replying. The nurse returned to check my vitals and mentioned casually that my medical decision-maker had been updated. She said it like it was just another line item, but to me, it felt monumental. The law had drawn a boundary where I finally could. As the afternoon light shifted across the room, I understood that this was the real turning point. My parents had left for a party. I had signed a consent form, believing they would protect me. Now, another form had changed everything. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. That evening settled into the room with a heavy stillness, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. The squeak of shoes in the hallway, the distant murmur of televisions from other rooms, the soft hiss of oxygen somewhere nearby. I lay there watching the light fade from the window, my body exhausted but my mind wide awake. Changing the paperwork should have made me feel powerful. Instead, it made everything painfully clear. I had just done in ink and signatures what I had never been allowed to do emotionally. I had acknowledged that my parents were not safe people to depend on when it mattered most. The truth of that pressed down on me harder than the surgery ever could. A nurse came in to administer medication and asked if I wanted to rest. I told her I would try. She smiled kindly and dimmed the lights, leaving the door slightly open. As the room darkened, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how many times I had been here before in different ways. Moments when I was hurting and alone, convincing myself it was normal that everyone dealt with things on their own. I thought about the first time my father yelled so close to my face that I could smell alcohol on his breath, and how my mother had later told me to be understanding because he worked hard. I thought about the bruises I had hidden under long sleeves and excuses. None of it had ever been labeled what it was. It was just family business. Something you did not talk about outside the house. The hospital room felt like the opposite of that world. Here, everything was documented. Every decision required consent. Every risk was explained out loud. There was no pretending nothing had happened. My phone buzzed again, lighting up the dark room. A group chat notification. Family checking in, my aunt asking for updates, someone else saying they heard I was doing okay. The words blurred together, all concern without accountability. I did not open the messages. I knew what would be waiting inside them. Sympathy mixed with excuses, pressure to minimize, requests to smooth things over so everyone could feel better about themselves. For the first time, I allowed myself not to play that role. I let the phone go dark and turned my head toward the wall. A sharp thought cut through the fog of medication. If I had not collapsed that morning, if this surgery had not forced the issue, nothing would have changed. My parents would have gone to the party, come home, and carried on as if everything were fine, and I would have helped them do it. That realization was as frightening as it was clarifying. It meant that my survival had given me a chance I might not get again, a chance to stop pretending. I shifted carefully, feeling the pull of stitches, and whispered the truth to myself for the first time. This was not just about one night. It was about years of being taught that my needs were inconvenient, about being raised to believe that love was something you earned by not asking for too much. The anger I had been holding back finally rose, not explosive, but deep and steady. It was anger at the system my family had built, one where my brother was protected and excused, and I was expected to absorb whatever was left over. It was anger at myself for accepting it for so long. Tears slid down the sides of my face and into my hair, silent and hot. I did not wipe them away. I let them fall. Crying in that dark room felt different from all the other times I had cried. This time, I was not trying to hide it or stop it or turn it into something palatable. This time, I was letting myself feel the full weight of what had been taken from me. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke again later that night, the pain was still there, but something else was there too. Resolve. I could not undo the past, but I could decide what story this moment would become. I could let it disappear into family silence, or I could refuse to carry it alone. Lying there listening to the quiet rhythm of the monitor, I made myself a promise. Whatever happened next, I would not protect anyone else's comfort at the expense of my own truth ever again. The next morning arrived with the dull ache of healing and the sharper clarity that comes after a night of difficult decisions. A pale band of light stretched across the floor as a nurse came in to check my vitals and update my chart. She told me I was stable, that recovery was progressing as expected, and that someone listed as my medical decision-maker had already called to confirm details. Lisa. Hearing her name out loud grounded me in a way I had not expected. It felt real now, not just a line on a form. The nurse asked if I wanted her to step out so I could take a call. I nodded, surprised at how natural it felt to accept care without apologizing for needing it. When Lisa's voice came through the phone, steady and warm, something in my chest loosened. She asked how much it hurt, whether I was scared, whether I needed anything. She did not rush me or minimize what had happened. She listened. When I told her I had changed the paperwork, she paused, then said she was honored and that she would be there. No conditions. No guilt. After we hung up, the room felt quieter but safer. A little later, the doctor returned with a resident to explain the next steps. He went over medications, potential complications, and the importance of follow-up. Then he asked a question that stopped the conversation cold. "Has your family been informed of the change to your consent authority?" I shook my head. He nodded and said the hospital would document it and communicate appropriately if needed. There was no drama in his voice, just procedure. That mattered. The law did not care about feelings. It cared about facts. My phone buzzed as if summoned by the thought. A message from my mother appeared on the screen, longer than the others. She wrote that she was upset I had not answered, that she had heard from someone that I was changing things, and that I was overreacting. She said families do not make decisions like this without talking it through. She said I was being unfair. I read the message twice, then set the phone down. For the first time, her words did not pull me into defending myself. They revealed exactly what I needed to see. She was not worried about my recovery. She was worried about losing control. The resident excused himself, and the doctor asked if I had questions. I asked him one thing. If something went wrong today, who would decide what happens to me? He looked at the chart and answered without hesitation. The person you designated, not your parents. The certainty of it sent a quiet shiver through me. This was the twist my parents did not anticipate. They had left assuming they could still decide for me later. They were wrong. By early afternoon, the hospital transferred me to a regular room. As they wheeled me down the hall, I passed the waiting area where families sat together sharing coffee and whispered conversations. I felt a pang of envy, then relief. Those scenes were not always what they looked like. Appearances could lie. In my new room, I noticed something else. A note taped to the whiteboard listed my care team, and beneath it, my designated contact. Lisa's name was written clearly in black marker. It was small, administrative, and quietly revolutionary. My parents had built a life around the assumption that they would always be the final authority. One signature had shifted that power. I did not feel triumphant. I felt protected. And as I lay back and closed my eyes, I understood that the consent form had not just changed a legal detail. It had changed the rules of my life. They told me the surgery itself had gone well, that the complication had been caught in time, that recovery would be uncomfortable but manageable if I followed instructions. I listened, nodded, thanked them, and let the words settle into a place that felt oddly distant. What stayed with me was not the medical explanation, but the simple fact that I had been unconscious while decisions hovered over my body like a shadow. The idea made my stomach tighten. I imagined how easily the story could have ended differently if I had not been awake enough to sign my name when it mattered. The nurse adjusted my blankets and asked if I wanted the lights dimmed. I said yes, and the room softened around me. Lying there, I replayed the moment before anesthesia took hold, the mask over my face, the last clear thought cutting through the fear. I had trusted the wrong people by default, and the system had been ready to honor that trust without question. That realization was sobering. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking to pain checks and quiet footsteps, each interruption pulling me back into the awareness that my body was fragile and dependent on others for the moment. It was humbling in a way I had never allowed myself to feel. I had built my identity around being capable, self-sufficient, low maintenance. Surgery stripped that away. It forced me to confront the truth that everyone, no matter how strong, eventually needs someone to stand in the gap. When I woke again, the room was darker evening settling in. My phone lay on the bedside table silent for once. The absence of messages felt intentional, as if my parents were recalibrating, trying to decide how to regain control of a situation that had slipped from their hands. I did not feel the urge to reach out. I felt tired in every sense of the word, tired of explaining, tired of justifying, tired of carrying the emotional labor of making other people comfortable with my pain. A nurse came in to administer medication and mentioned casually that Lisa had checked in again, confirming she could come by in the morning. The nurse smiled when she said it, and something about that smile told me this was what support was supposed to look like. Not obligation, not appearances, presence. After she left, I stared at the ceiling and let myself imagine a different future, one where my worth was not measured by how little I asked for. One where being strong did not mean being alone. The thought felt unfamiliar but hopeful. Pain flared as I shifted, reminding me that recovery would be slow and that there would be moments when I would need help whether I liked it or not. For the first time, that did not feel like a failure. It felt honest. As the night deepened, I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing in and out, steady and deliberate. Somewhere beyond the walls of the hospital, my parents were likely replaying the night, justifying their choices, rehearsing explanations that made them look reasonable. I did not need to hear them anymore. The consent form had already spoken for me. The law had drawn a line where I finally could. And as sleep pulled me under again, I understood that surviving the surgery was only the beginning. The real work would be learning how to live without shrinking myself to fit into a family that had already shown me where I ranked. The morning Lisa arrived was the first time the hospital room felt warm. She stepped in quietly, careful not to startle me, carrying a small bag with my favorite lip balm and a cardigan I had left at her place months ago. The familiarity of it hit me harder than I expected. She did not ask why my parents were not there. She did not comment on the empty chair. She simply sat down, took my hand, and asked how much it hurt. That simple question, asked without an agenda, cracked something open inside me. I answered honestly. She listened without interrupting, without minimizing, without trying to fix it. When a nurse came in and addressed Lisa as my medical decision-maker, watching her nod and respond with quiet confidence felt surreal. This was what it looked like when someone took responsibility seriously. Not loudly, not performatively, just steadily. After the nurse left, Lisa asked if I wanted to talk about my parents. I shook my head. Not yet, I said. She respected that without making me feel guilty. The doctor stopped by later to check my incision and review my labs. He explained that the next 48 hours were important and that I should not hesitate to call if something felt off. He asked if my support person would be available. I watched as Lisa answered for both of us. Yes, absolutely. The ease of it made my chest ache. Outside the room, I could hear a family laughing down the hall, a child's voice carrying through the space. For a moment, grief washed over me, sharp and unexpected. Not envy, grief. For the version of family I had always hoped would show up when it counted. Lisa noticed my expression and squeezed my hand gently. "It is okay to be sad," she said. "You do not have to make excuses for them with me." That was when I realized how much of my life had been spent translating pain into something acceptable, making it smaller, making it quieter. I had never needed to do that here. My phone buzzed again on the tray. A message from my mother, longer than the last, filled with concern that felt rehearsed. She wrote that she was worried about me, that she had been busy the night before, but that did not mean she did not care. She said families make mistakes and move on. She asked when she could visit. I felt a familiar pull to respond to reassure her, to smooth the edges. Instead, I handed the phone to Lisa and asked her to read it. She did, then looked up at me with a steady expression. "What do you want?" she asked. The question landed differently than all the others had. Not what would make things easier, not what would keep the peace. "What do you want?" I took a breath, feeling the tug of stitches as I did. "I want space," I said. "Real space. Not silence that we pretend is fine." Lisa nodded and asked if I wanted help communicating that. I did. Together, we drafted a short message. I wrote that I was recovering, that I needed time, and that I would reach out when I was ready. I did not apologize. I did not explain. I pressed send and felt my shoulders drop an inch. A nurse came in shortly after and reminded me to walk a little with assistance. As Lisa helped me swing my legs over the side of the bed, the room tilted and pain flared, but I did it. Each step was slow and careful, but it was mine. As I settled back into bed, exhausted, I caught sight of the whiteboard again. My name. My care plan. My designated contact. The sight of it grounded me. The law had already recognized what my family had not. That my body and my choices belonged to me. As the afternoon wore on and Lisa dozed lightly in the chair beside my bed, I stared at the ceiling and let the truth settle fully. My parents had left for a party. I had survived without them. And now, for the first time, I was allowing myself to build a life that did not require their approval to feel safe. The afternoon blurred into a rhythm of small victories and quiet realizations. I took another slow walk with a nurse counted breaths through a spike of pain and learned how to brace my abdomen before sitting up. Each instruction felt practical and grounding, a reminder that healing was not dramatic but deliberate. When I settled back into bed, I reached for my phone again, not with hope this time, but with resolve. The messages had stacked up while I slept. Family group chats filled with concern, shaped like noise ants and cousins asking for updates, asking if the rumors were true, asking if my parents had really left. The questions were polite, curious, carefully worded to avoid blame. I scrolled without answering. Then I opened my camera and saw my reflection on the screen. Pale, tired, hospital bracelet sharp against my wrist. The IV tape creased the back of my hand. It was not flattering, it was honest. I took a photo without adjusting the angle, without trying to soften anything. I stared at it for a long moment, my thumb hovering as if the screen could tell me what to do next. I thought about how many times I had stayed quiet to keep the story simple for everyone else. How often I had absorbed the discomfort so no one had to feel accused. I opened my notes app instead of social media and began to type not a speech, not a rant, but a record. I wrote about the pain that morning and the ambulance ride. I wrote about hearing my mother say she would be fine and the sound of footsteps leaving. I wrote about the consent form and the empty chair and waking up alone. I wrote about the party photos and the word routine. The words came faster than I expected, clean and direct, as if they had been waiting for permission. When I finished, my hands were shaking, but my chest felt lighter. I copied one sentence from the note and opened my social media app. I did not tag anyone. I did not name names. I posted the photo with a caption that was short enough to be undeniable. Emergency surgery. My parents left for a party. The consent form changed everything. I set the phone down and closed my eyes before I could second-guess myself. Within minutes, the device buzzed against the tray. Notifications stacked one after another, a steady vibration that felt like a pulse. I did not look right away. I focused on my breathing in and out steady. When I finally picked up the phone, the comments were already multiplying. "Are you okay? This is heartbreaking. How could anyone do that?" Messages poured in from friends I had not spoken to in years, from coworkers who recognized the bracelet, from strangers who said they had been the strong one too. A few comments came from people who had been at the party. They wrote that they had assumed I was fine because that was what my mother had said. Reading those words confirmed what I already knew. The lie had been comfortable. The truth was inconvenient. My phone rang. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. Another call followed, then a text that read, "Take that down, you are making us look bad." The speed of the response was telling. They had not rushed to the hospital, but they rushed to protect their image. Lisa stirred in the chair and asked if I wanted her to get the nurse. I shook my head and showed her the screen. She read the caption and smiled softly. "That is clear," she said. "It does not exaggerate. It just states what happened." The phone buzzed again, this time from my brother. He wrote that people were calling him, that I was being unfair, that family business should stay private. I felt a familiar pressure to explain, to justify, to soften. Instead, I typed one sentence and sent it. It was not private when I was alone in surgery. The messages slowed, then surged again. Some were angry, Some were apologetic. Some asked me to delete the post for the sake of peace. I did not respond. I placed the phone face down and rested my hands on my stomach, feeling the gentle rise and fall of my breath. For the first time, the consequences were not mine to manage. I had told the truth without decoration. If that truth made people uncomfortable, it was because it belonged to them now, not me. The reaction did not fade overnight. It intensified. By morning, my phone felt heavier, as if the weight of everyone else's opinions had settled inside it. I watched notifications roll in without opening them, letting the screen light up and dim again like a warning signal I no longer needed to answer. A nurse came in to check my incision and smiled when she saw I was awake. She asked how I was feeling and whether I had slept. I told her I had. It was not entirely true, but it was closer than it had been before. After she left, Lisa read a few messages out loud at my request, choosing carefully. Some were simple expressions of concern. Some were stories from people who said they had been left alone in hospitals, graduations, funerals, all because they were considered strong. Hearing those words echoed back to me by strangers was unsettling and validating at the same time. The pattern was bigger than my family. That realization steadied me. Around mid-morning, the hospital phone rang. The front desk said my parents were downstairs asking to come up. The wording mattered. Asking. Usually they assumed. I asked the nurse what my options were. She told me I could limit visitors and that staff would enforce it. I thought about the empty chair and the party photos and the message telling me to take the post down. I told her I would see my mother later briefly and not my father or brother. The nurse nodded and said she would arrange it. When she left, my heart began to race, not from fear, but from the knowledge that this conversation would not be smoothed over the way it always had been. I practiced what I might say, then let it go. Scripts had never protected me. The door opened quietly, and my mother stepped in her expression, tight eyes rimmed with red. She looked smaller somehow, like the room had shifted around her. She did not sit right away. She stood near the foot of the bed, arms crossed, scanning my face as if assessing damage. I was glad I was already lying down. "Kayla," she said, her voice controlled. "We need to talk about what you posted." I waited. She continued saying people were calling, asking questions, making assumptions. She said she felt attacked and embarrassed. She said she never meant to hurt me. I listened without interrupting, noticing what she did not say. She did not ask how much pain I was in. She did not ask if I was scared. When she finally paused, I spoke calmly. "You left me alone before surgery," I said. "I heard you say I would be fine." Her mouth tightened. She said they had been told it was routine. She said I was always strong. There it was again. I asked her a question I had not planned. If it were Mark, would you have left? She did not answer right away. The silence stretched. Finally, she said that was different. "He has responsibilities." I nodded slowly. "So do I said. "I have the responsibility to keep myself safe." She bristled and said posting it publicly was cruel. The word landed hard. Cruel. I felt something settle in my chest. Cruel was leaving, I said. Cruel was assuming I would handle it so you did not have to. Telling the truth about it is not cruelty. It is accountability. She looked away, her eyes flicking toward the door as if looking for backup that was not coming. I told her I had changed my medical decision-maker. Her head snapped back to me. "You did what?" I explained calmly that the hospital had updated my paperwork and that Lisa was now listed. My mother's face flushed. "You did that without telling us," she said. I met her gaze. "You left without telling me." The nurse knocked lightly and stepped in, checking my chart and asking if everything was okay. The interruption shifted something. My mother straightened her voice softer now, careful. She said she loved me and that families make mistakes. I told her love without presence felt empty. I told her I needed space and time and that I would not take the post down. Her eyes filled with tears, but there was anger there too. She said I was punishing them. I shook my head. "I am protecting myself," I said. The nurse returned to say visiting time was over. My mother hesitated, then turned to leave. At the door, she looked back and said she hoped I would calm down soon. When she was gone, the room felt quieter, cleaner somehow. Lisa squeezed my hand. "That was hard," she said. I nodded. It was. but it was also the first conversation where I did not betray myself to keep the peace. After my mother left the room, settled into a heavy quiet that felt earned. I did not feel victorious. I felt wrung out, like every conversation I had avoided for years had finally happened all at once. Lisa stayed beside me, not filling the silence, just being there. A nurse came in to check my vitals and asked gently if I was okay. I told her yes, and this time it was true. Not because things were resolved, but because they were no longer hidden. The truth had been said out loud, and it could not be taken back. As the afternoon wore on, my phone continued to buzz in waves. Messages from relatives shifted in tone, moving from disbelief to damage control. A cousin wrote that my post was causing problems at church. An aunt suggested I delete it and talk things out privately. Someone else reminded me that my parents had done their best and that no one was perfect. I read them all without replying. The pattern was familiar. When harm happened quietly, it was excused. When it was exposed, it became inconvenient. A little later, the nurse returned with paperwork for discharge planning and asked who would be picking me up when I was cleared to leave. Lisa answered without hesitation. Hearing someone else speak for me in that way felt grounding. The hospital was already adjusting to the reality my family was still resisting. That contrast mattered. By early evening, a new message appeared on my screen, this one from a family friend who had been at the party. She wrote that she had assumed my parents would stay with me, that she had asked if they were sure, and that my mother had waved it off saying I was strong and that hospitals always overreacted. Reading that confirmation made my hands shake, not with doubt, but with certainty. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice. I opened my original post and reread the caption. It was still true. It still felt measured. I decided to add one sentence beneath it, not as an attack, but as a boundary. Update. I am recovering. I have changed my medical decision maker. I need space and time. I hit save and set the phone aside. The response was immediate. Support flooded in from unexpected places. People thanked me for being honest. Others shared their own stories of being left to handle things alone. A few messages from my parents' circle went quiet altogether. Silence, it turned out, was not always my burden to carry. As the sky darkened outside the window, the nurse dimmed the lights and asked if I needed anything else. I said no. My body ached, exhaustion pulling at me, but my mind felt clearer than it had in years. I thought about the consent form again, the way one piece of paper had shifted the power dynamic my family had taken for granted. It was not the law alone that had changed everything. It was my willingness to stop cooperating with my own erasure. Lisa gathered her things and told me she would be back early in the morning. Before she left, she asked a simple question. "Are you okay with what you did?" I did not answer right away. I thought about the empty chair, the party photos, the word cruel thrown at me for telling the truth. Then I nodded. Yes, I said, because if I had stayed quiet, nothing would be different. Alone again in the room, I listened to the steady beep of the monitor and felt the weight of the day settle into my bones. There would be fallout. There would be uncomfortable conversations and attempts to rewrite what had happened. But there would also be something I had never really had before. Leverage. Not over them, but over my own life. The consent form had changed everything, but so had my refusal to bleed in private anymore. The fallout arrived the next morning like a controlled burn that still managed to scorch everything it touched. I woke to my phone vibrating against the tray, a steady insistence that told me the story had moved beyond whispers. Lisa was on her way, the nurse said, but before anyone else arrived, the messages kept coming. Some were concerned, others sharp. A few were attempts to bargain. Delete the post and we will talk. Take it down and this can blow over. The language was revealing. Not apologize and repair, blow over, as if the problem were visibility, not abandonment. A nurse stepped in to check my incision and noticed the tension in my shoulders. She reminded me to breathe and asked if I wanted visitors limited for the day. I said yes. She nodded and made a note without asking me to justify it. That quiet respect felt like oxygen. When Lisa arrived, she brought coffee and a folded newspaper. She thought I might want a small nod to normalcy. We sat together while I read through a few more messages, choosing carefully. One stood out from a cousin I had always liked. She wrote that she had been in the room when my parents decided to leave, that she had felt uncomfortable but had not spoken up. "I am sorry," she said. I should have said something. The apology mattered. It named responsibility instead of explaining it away. A little later, the hospital phone rang again. My father this time, his voice low and controlled. He said the post had embarrassed the family and that people were calling him at work. He said this was not how we handled problems. I asked him a question I had been avoiding. "Why did you leave?" There was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. He said my mother believed it was routine and that they trusted I would be fine. He said they had raised me to be independent. I heard the familiar reframing and interrupted gently. "Independence is not consent to be abandoned," I said. He sighed and told me I was being dramatic. The word landed flat. I ended the call. My hands shook afterward, the adrenaline slow to fade. Lisa put her hand over mine and asked if I wanted to talk to the social worker the nurse had mentioned. I said yes. The social worker arrived mid-afternoon, calm and precise, and asked me about my support system and my plans after discharge. She explained my rights, including my right to designate visitors and decision-makers. She asked if I felt safe returning home. The question surprised me with its directness. I told her I would be staying with Lisa for a while. She nodded and wrote it down. She did not ask why. She did not suggest reconciliation. She focused on safety and stability. That focus mattered. Later, a notification flashed that my post had been shared again this time by someone in our community who wrote about the importance of advance directives. The framing shifted in real time. What my parents wanted to paint as cruelty was being understood as preparation, as prudence, as self-respect. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. By evening, my brother sent a message that cut through the noise. He wrote that I had gone too far, that our parents were upset that this could affect their standing. He asked if I was happy now. I stared at the question, then typed and erased a dozen responses. In the end, I sent one sentence. "I am focused on healing. That is all." I put the phone down and watched the sky darken through the narrow window. The day had been heavy, but something else had happened too. The story had stopped being about whether I would forgive them and started being about whether they would change. That shift felt important. As the nurse came in to administer medication, she mentioned that my discharge could be as soon as the next day if things continued to improve. The idea felt both relieving and daunting. Leaving the hospital would mean facing the world with this new boundary in place. It would mean not backtracking when the discomfort grew. I closed my eyes and let the medication pull me toward sleep, holding on to one steady thought. I did not owe anyone silence to make their choices easier. The consent form had changed everything once. I was not about to pretend it had not. The confrontation came sooner than I expected, not in a dramatic burst, but in a quiet, controlled moment that felt heavier because of its restraint. That afternoon, a nurse told me my parents were back downstairs and asking to speak with me together. The wording again mattered. Asking. I took a slow breath, feeling the tight pull of my stitches, and considered what I wanted from this meeting. Not absolution, not promises, clarity. I told the nurse they could come up, but only briefly, and that I wanted staff nearby. She nodded, her expression neutral and reassuring. When the door opened, my parents stepped in side by side, my father's jaw set. My mother's shoulders tense. They looked around the room as if searching for something familiar to anchor themselves, and I realized how different this space was from their living room, from the environments where they usually controlled the narrative. My mother spoke first. She said my post had spiraled, that people were judging them without knowing the full story. She said they had been told the surgery was routine and that they trusted the doctors. She said I had always handled things well on my own. I listened without interrupting, noticing again what she did not say. She did not say she was sorry she left. She did not say she wished she had stayed. My father added that families did not air their problems publicly and that I had crossed a line. He said I should take the post down and we could move on. The word move on landed like a command. I waited until he finished, then spoke calmly. "You left before my surgery," I said. "I heard you say I would be fine. You chose a party." My mother opened her mouth to respond, but I raised my hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to keep my voice steady. "I am not debating whether you meant harm," I continued. "I am telling you what happened." My father shifted his weight and said I was twisting things. I asked him a question I had practiced in my head. If something had gone wrong during surgery, who would have made decisions for me? He hesitated. I told him the answer. You would have, because I trusted you by default. The room went quiet. I could hear the distant beep of a monitor from another room. I told them I had changed my medical decision maker. My mother stiffened. My father asked if that was even legal. I nodded. It is. The hospital confirmed it. Lisa is listed now. My mother's voice sharpened. You did that behind our backs. I met her gaze. You left behind my back. The symmetry of it seemed to catch her off guard. My father tried a different angle. He said I was being influenced, that I was emotional from surgery, that I would regret this. I felt a flicker of anger, but it stayed contained. I am clear, I said. This is not punishment. This is protection. A nurse knocked and stepped in, glancing at my chart and asking if everything was okay. The interruption grounded the moment. My parents straightened their voices, lowering. I took the opportunity to say what mattered most. I am not taking the post down, I said. It is factual. If it makes you uncomfortable, that is because of the choice you made. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I almost reached for her. The old reflex stirred. Then she spoke, and the reflex died. She said I was ruining the family's reputation. The focus snapped into place. Reputation. Not recovery, not fear, not regret. I told her quietly that my body was not a backdrop for their image. I told them I needed space and time, and that if we were going to have a relationship going forward, it would involve accountability and change, not explanations. My father shook his head, frustrated, and said I was making things harder than they needed to be. I felt a surprising calm as I answered. It was already hard. You just did not have to feel it before. The nurse returned and said visiting time was over. My parents lingered as if waiting for me to soften. I did not. My mother finally nodded stiffly and said we would talk later. I said maybe. When they left, the door closing behind them sounded final in a way I had never allowed before. Lisa squeezed my hand. You did not back down, she said. I leaned back against the pillows, exhausted but steady. I had not raised my voice. I had not begged. I had not apologized for telling the truth. For the first time, the confrontation did not end with me shrinking to restore peace. It ended with boundaries that held. After my parents left, the room felt strangely lighter, as if the air itself had been cleared of something stale. I lay back against the pillows, my heart still racing, but beneath the adrenaline was a deep, steady calm. The confrontation had not gone the way they wanted. It had gone the way it needed to. A nurse came in a few minutes later, checked my blood pressure, and asked if I wanted a moment alone or company. I told her I was okay. She nodded and said she would be nearby if I needed anything. That simple assurance stayed with me. Someone had said they would stay, and they meant it. Lisa sat quietly in the chair, scrolling on her phone, giving me space without withdrawing. I closed my eyes and replayed the conversation, not to second-guess myself, but to mark what was different. I had not defended my feelings. I had stated facts. I had not apologized for needing safety. I had named the line they crossed and refused to move it back for their comfort. That was new. Later that evening, the hospital administrator stopped by with a clipboard to confirm discharge details. As part of the routine, she reviewed my chart and verbally confirmed my medical decision-maker. She said Lisa's name clearly, then added that any future updates or decisions would go through her unless I changed it in writing. My parents' names did not come up at all. It was administrative, procedural, unemotional, and it carried more weight than any argument I had ever had at home. This was the twist my family could not argue with. There was no tone to police, no feelings to dismiss. The system had moved on without them. My phone buzzed again. A message from my mother appeared shorter this time. We need time to process this. I read it once and set the phone down. For the first time, I did not feel compelled to respond. Processing was not my responsibility anymore. A little while later, a notification popped up from a local community page where my post had been shared again, this time alongside information about medical consent and advance directives. People were commenting about how they had never thought to update their paperwork, how they assumed family would do the right thing. Reading those comments, I felt something unexpected. Purpose. What had happened to me was no longer just a personal wound. It was a cautionary truth others were learning from. The nurse came in to help me walk again, slow steps down the hallway, her hand steady at my elbow. As we passed the waiting room, I noticed my parents were no longer there. I did not know when they had left, and I did not ask. Their absence did not register the way it once would have. Back in my room, I settled into bed exhausted. The pain medication dulled the edges, but my thoughts stayed clear. I thought about the phrase my parents kept using: move on. What they meant was return to the old balance where discomfort was mine to manage and silence was the price of belonging. That balance no longer existed. I had changed it in ink and in truth. As night fell, I opened my notes app again and added a line beneath the record I had started days ago. I wrote that boundaries are not punishments. They are information. They tell people what access they have and what behavior is required to keep it. Writing it down felt like sealing a decision. I turned off the light and let the quiet settle in. Tomorrow I would leave the hospital. The world outside would not be gentle and my family would not suddenly become different people. But the rules had changed. The consent form had stripped away their authority, and my refusal to hide had stripped away their narrative. For the first time, I would be walking back into my life with protection that did not depend on anyone else choosing me. The day I was cleared for discharge arrived quietly without ceremony, like most real turning points do. A nurse reviewed my instructions, medications, and follow-up appointments, her voice steady and precise. She asked if I had transportation arranged and confirmed that Lisa would be picking me up. My parents' names were not mentioned, not once. That omission felt louder than anything said out loud. As I signed the last of the paperwork, I felt the weight of the week settle into my shoulders. My body was healing slowly and imperfectly, but something deeper had already shifted. The social worker stopped by one last time to make sure I felt safe with my plan. She reminded me that I could change my visitor list at any point, and that support resources were available if I needed them. The word safe echoed in my head. It was a word I had rarely associated with family. Lisa arrived mid-morning, cheerful but gentle, helping me into a sweater and steadying me as I stood. Each movement sent a reminder through my abdomen, sharp and insistent, but I welcomed it. Pain was honest. As we made our way down the hallway, I noticed the familiar landmarks of the hospital with new eyes, the waiting room where families gathered, the elevators where people whispered prayers, the front desk where nurses greeted everyone the same way, regardless of who they were with. Outside sunlight hit my face brighter than I expected. The fresh air made me dizzy for a moment, and Lisa paused, giving me time to breathe. In the car, as we pulled away, my phone buzzed again. A message from my father this time, carefully worded. He wrote that they were hurt by how things had unfolded and that they hoped I would reconsider taking the post down once I had some distance from the situation. I read it, then set the phone face down. Distance was exactly what I was choosing. At Lisa's apartment, she helped me settle onto the couch pillows arranged just right. The space was small, lived in warm. It felt safer than any house I had grown up in. She made tea and sat across from me, asking what I needed. The question still felt unfamiliar, but I answered honestly. Rest, I said. Time. Later that afternoon, I opened my social media again, not to argue or explain, but to add clarity. I edited the post with a brief update stating that I was recovering and that I had updated my medical consent to reflect who was actually present for me. I did not accuse. I did not justify. The response shifted again. The conversation moved away from my parents and toward the importance of preparation and boundaries. People shared articles. Others asked how to set up advance directives. The focus was no longer on drama. It was on responsibility. That shift was the clearest form of justice I could have imagined. My parents had framed my honesty as cruelty, but the wider world saw it as caution and self-respect. As evening settled in, pain flared again, reminding me that healing was not linear. Lisa brought me medication and sat nearby, reading quietly. The presence was simple, unremarkable, and exactly what I needed. I thought about my mother's insistence that families move on. What she meant was forget. Forget the empty chair. Forget the consent form. Forget the choice they made when it mattered. I would not forget, not to punish them, but to protect myself. Before bed, I opened my notes app and wrote one more line beneath the others. Justice does not always look like consequences handed down. Sometimes it looks like access removed. I set the phone aside and closed my eyes, letting exhaustion take me. The law had chosen who could decide for me, but I had chosen who could stay. And that choice, quiet and firm, was the clearest kind of justice I knew. The consequences did not explode all at once. They spread slowly like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped into still water. In the days after I left the hospital, my parents began to feel what it meant to lose control of the story. Relatives stopped calling them for explanations and started messaging me instead. A few asked gentle questions. Others said nothing at all, their silence heavy with judgment. The church my parents attended paused before assigning my mother another volunteer role. A family friend canceled a dinner invitation without explanation. None of it was dramatic. No one confronted them publicly. But the air around them changed, and they felt it. My mother sent messages that grew shorter and more careful. She asked how I was healing, then quickly pivoted to how stressed she felt, how hard this had been for her. I did not take the bait. I replied only when necessary and only with facts. Recovery was progressing. I was following doctor's orders. I would reach out when ready. The restraint unsettled her more than anger ever had. My father stayed quiet longer, then sent a message that read like a draft revised too many times. He said he was proud of my strength, that he hoped I understood they never meant to hurt me. The familiar language tried to reassert itself. Strength as a shield. Strength as a dismissal. I read it once and archived it. Mark, my brother, unfollowed me on social media without a word. A week later, a mutual acquaintance mentioned he was angry that I had made things public. I felt a brief sting, then relief. His reaction confirmed what I already knew. Accountability threatened the hierarchy that had always protected him. Meanwhile, messages from outside my family continued to arrive. Women older than me wrote about surgeries where no one came. Men shared stories of being the responsible one everyone relied on but no one checked on. Several people asked practical questions about medical consent, about how to name a decision-maker who would actually show up. I answered when I had the energy. It felt strange turning pain into guidance, but it also felt right. The narrative had shifted beyond my parents' reach. They could not minimize it without minimizing a much larger truth that people were already recognizing in themselves. One afternoon, my mother called again. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, her voice was tight controlled. She said people were treating her differently. She said she felt judged. She said she wished I would consider how this was affecting the family. I did not call back. The difference now was clear. For the first time, the discomfort was not mine alone to manage. They were experiencing the social cost of a choice they had made in private. That cost was not punishment. It was consequence. At Lisa's apartment, life settled into a new rhythm. Follow-up appointments, slow walks, careful meals, rest. The ordinary details of recovery grounded me. Each day I felt a little stronger, not just physically, but in the quiet confidence that came from not chasing approval. I began to understand something else, something I had never fully allowed before. Justice did not require my parents to admit fault or beg forgiveness. Justice was already happening in the subtle reordering of access and influence. They no longer spoke for me. They no longer decided for me. They no longer controlled how my pain was framed. The world saw what it needed to see, and then it moved on, leaving them to sit with the gap between who they believed themselves to be and what they had actually done. As for me, I was no longer waiting for them to change in order to feel whole. That was the quietest and most powerful consequence of all. By the second week after my discharge, the world felt smaller in a way that was both limiting and safe. My days revolved around recovery schedules, gentle stretches, medication alarms, and the slow rebuilding of strength. The simplicity gave me space to think clearly. With distance from the hospital and the noise of immediate fallout, I could finally see the shape of what needed to come next. Boundaries were not a speech or a post. They were actions repeated consistently, even when it was uncomfortable. One afternoon, after a follow-up appointment, confirmed my healing was on track. I sat at Lisa's kitchen table and wrote out what those boundaries would look like. I did not frame them as punishments. I framed them as conditions for access. If my parents wanted a relationship with me, it would require specific changes. Therapy not as a gesture, but as an ongoing commitment. No unannounced visits. No dismissive language about strength or routine when it came to my health. No rewriting of the night they left. The facts would remain intact. Writing it down felt formal, almost legal, and that was intentional. Vague expectations had failed me my entire life. Clarity was protection. When my mother texted asking if she could stop by, I replied with a short message explaining that I was not ready for in-person visits and that I would reach out when I was. I did not add apologies or explanations. The response came quickly, a mix of frustration and forced understanding. She said she was trying, that this was hard for her. I did not engage with the emotional pull. Hard did not mean wrong. Later that evening, my father sent a message asking if we could talk privately, just the two of us. I told him I was open to a conversation after he had started therapy. The words surprised me as much as they likely surprised him. He did not reply. That silence told me everything I needed to know about his readiness to change. Mark remained absent, a quiet presence in the background of my thoughts, but no longer central. I realized that the hierarchy that had once defined our family was already cracking, and it was not my job to hold it together. Outside that circle, life continued to offer small proofs that my choices were sound. Lisa's neighbors checked in. A coworker dropped off groceries. The doctor called personally to review lab results and answer questions. None of these people shared my last name. Yet they showed up in ways that mattered. It reframed my understanding of family in real time. Family was not proximity or obligation. It was presence and responsibility. One evening, as I carefully walked a few laps around the block, I felt a familiar fear creep in. The fear that I was being too harsh, too final. The fear that I would regret this distance later. I paused, steadying myself on a fence, and asked the question honestly. What would regret look like? It would look like waking up alone again while someone else decided I would be fine. That answer settled the fear. Back at the apartment, I updated my emergency contact information everywhere it mattered. Doctor's offices, insurance, work. I also completed a more comprehensive advance directive one that spelled out my wishes clearly. It was not morbid, it was practical. Each step reinforced the same truth. Safety was something I could build deliberately. When my mother finally acknowledged my message about boundaries, she said she felt excluded and punished. I responded once calmly. Boundaries are not punishment. They are the terms under which I can be present without harm. I did not elaborate. I did not debate. For the first time, I let the words stand on their own. As the weeks passed, the intensity of the situation softened, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been integrated. My parents adjusted awkwardly and unevenly to the new limits. Some days were easier than others, but the direction was set. I was no longer negotiating my worth. I was enforcing my safety. The consent form had changed everything in a moment of crisis. The boundaries I built afterward ensured that change would last in ordinary life where it mattered most. The first real test of those boundaries came quietly without warning, the way most long-standing patterns try to reassert themselves. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of slow, empty day that used to belong to my parents by default. My phone rang with my mother's name on the screen. I let it ring out and waited. A text followed almost immediately saying she was nearby and thought she would stop in just to check on me. Just to check on me. The phrase was familiar, harmless on the surface, loaded underneath. I read it twice, then replied with one sentence, the same one I had practiced. I am not ready for visits. Please respect that. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. She wrote back that she did not understand why I was still being distant, that she was trying to be supportive now that I was making things harder than they needed to be. The old pull tugged at me, the reflex to explain, to reassure, to soften the blow. I felt it in my chest, sharp and insistent. Then I remembered the empty chair by my hospital bed and the way support had arrived only when it became inconvenient not to. I did not respond. The silence that followed was tense but clean. Later that evening, my father sent a message asking how my follow-up appointment had gone. The question was neutral, almost careful. I answered with facts. Healing was on track. Doctor was satisfied. No complications. He replied that he was glad to hear it and added that maybe once things settled we could all sit down and talk like adults. The implication was clear. Settling meant forgetting. I let the message sit unanswered. Across the week, small shifts continued. My parents stopped using the word strong when they spoke to me. Instead, they avoided discussing my health altogether. It was not progress, but it was adjustment. Mark remained absent, a presence defined by silence rather than confrontation. I learned from a cousin that he was angry that he felt I had embarrassed the family. The information no longer carried the weight it once would have. His anger was part of the same structure I had stepped out of. At Lisa's apartment, my life took on a steadier rhythm. I returned to remote work in short increments. I cooked simple meals. I slept without bracing for the next emotional demand. In the quiet, I noticed something unexpected. My body healed faster when my nervous system was not constantly on alert. Rest was not just physical, it was relational. One afternoon, a message arrived from my mother that was different in tone. She wrote that she had scheduled a therapy appointment. She did not frame it as a favor or a sacrifice. She simply stated it. I read it and sat with the information for a long moment. It was a start, not a resolution. I replied with a single line. "Thank you for telling me. We can talk after you have gone a few times." There was no argument this time, no pushback, just a short acknowledgement. The change was subtle, but it was real. That evening, as I took a careful walk around the block, the sun dipping low and warm against my skin, I thought about what accountability actually looked like. It was not tears or promises made in the heat of embarrassment. It was consistent action when no one was watching. It was discomfort endured without passing it back to the person who had already carried too much. For the first time, I felt no urgency to rush the process. Healing did not require immediate reconciliation. It required honesty sustained over time. When I returned to the apartment, Lisa asked how I was feeling. I considered the question seriously before answering. "Steadier," I said, not because everything was fixed, but because I was no longer pretending it was. The aftermath was not dramatic. It was slow, uneven, and real. And in that reality, I was finally learning the difference between endurance and self-respect. As my body grew stronger, my life began to widen again in small, careful ways. The doctor cleared me for longer walks, then short drives, then a gradual return to normal routines. Each milestone felt earned. I moved deliberately, listening to my body, instead of pushing past its limits the way I used to. That shift alone felt like a quiet rebellion against everything I had been taught. At Lisa's apartment, mornings became gentle and predictable. Coffee at the same time, medication with breakfast, a short walk if the weather allowed. The structure soothed me. It reminded me that stability did not have to be rigid or punishing. It could be supportive. When I returned to work part-time, my manager checked in without prying and adjusted expectations without making me feel guilty. The contrast to my family's response was stark. Care I was learning did not require drama to be real. Messages from my parents continued cautious and measured. My mother updated me occasionally about therapy sessions, mentioning topics they were covering without asking me to fix or validate her feelings. My father sent neutral check-ins, short and respectful. It was not warmth, but it was restraint. For now, that was enough. Mark remained distant, his absence filling a space that used to feel crowded. Without his presence dominating conversations, I noticed how much quieter my internal world had become. I was no longer bracing for comparisons or subtle dismissals. The relief was tangible. One afternoon, while sorting mail forwarded from my old address, I found a card from a former coworker who had seen my post. She wrote that it had prompted her to update her own medical paperwork and to talk with her adult daughter about expectations. She thanked me for being brave. I held the card for a long moment, surprised by how much it meant. The ripple effects of that one honest sentence were still moving outward. In a way, the story had stopped belonging to my family entirely. It belonged to the people who recognized themselves in it and made changes quietly without fanfare. That realization reframed the pain in a way that felt purposeful rather than consuming. One evening, I finally sat down to read the entire thread of comments beneath my post. I had avoided it until then, afraid of reopening wounds. What I found instead was a community of people speaking plainly about neglect, about the burden of being labeled strong, about the cost of silence. I did not respond to all of them, but I acknowledged a few, thanking them for sharing. It felt like closing a loop. As the weeks passed, the intensity of the situation softened into something more manageable. Not erased, but integrated. I began to think about moving back into my own place. Lisa supported the idea without pushing, helping me plan the transition in practical steps. The prospect felt empowering rather than frightening. Independence redefined was no longer about doing everything alone. It was about choosing support that did not disappear when things became inconvenient. When my mother asked if we could meet for coffee in a public place, I agreed with conditions. We met mid-morning at a quiet cafe. The conversation stayed on neutral ground. No rewriting, no minimizing. When she drifted toward justification, I redirected gently and firmly. She listened more than she spoke. It was awkward and unfinished, but it was honest. That mattered. Back at home later that day, I noticed something else. I was no longer replaying conversations in my head, searching for what I could have said differently. The compulsion to self-correct had loosened its grip. In its place was a steadier confidence that I could handle discomfort without collapsing into guilt. Healing, I realized, was not just about closing wounds. It was about learning new reflexes. As I prepared for bed that night, I updated my calendar with upcoming appointments and commitments. The ordinary details of a life resumed. Before turning off the light, I paused and considered how far I had come from the woman who lay alone behind a hospital curtain, listening to footsteps fade. That woman had believed strength meant endurance without complaint. This one understood something deeper. Strength meant choosing conditions where care could exist. The consent form had been the catalyst. The boundaries were the continuation. And the life I was rebuilding piece by piece was proof that quiet, consistent change could outlast any single moment of betrayal. By the time my doctor cleared me for full activity, the season had shifted. The days were longer, the air warmer, and my body finally felt like it belonged to me again. The scar across my abdomen had faded from angry red to a thin, pale line, a quiet reminder rather than an open wound. I traced it absent-mindedly one morning and realized something surprising. I did not feel bitterness when I thought about the hospital anymore. I felt clarity. The memory no longer controlled me. It informed me. That distinction mattered. I moved back into my apartment, slowly unpacking boxes over several days, letting the space fill with intention rather than urgency. I changed small things that felt symbolic. I rearranged the furniture so the couch faced the window instead of the door. I replaced the emergency contact on the refrigerator magnet. I added a folder labeled Medical and Legal to my desk drawer and placed copies of my advance directive inside. None of it felt dramatic. It felt responsible. Friends came by in short visits, bringing groceries, sharing stories, respecting when I needed rest. The ease of those interactions reinforced what I had learned. Healthy relationships did not require negotiation around basic care. Around that time, my mother asked if we could attend a therapy session together. I considered the request carefully, not because I was afraid, but because I was no longer willing to rush healing for anyone else's timeline. I agreed with boundaries. One session, no ambushing, no minimizing. The therapist set clear ground rules, and for the first time, my mother listened without interrupting. She spoke about fear, about image, about how she had learned to prioritize appearances over presence. I listened without rescuing her from discomfort. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly about the hospital, about the consent form, about the years of being told I was strong instead of being shown care. The room held the truth without collapsing. That alone felt like progress. My father attended his own sessions separately. We spoke occasionally cautiously. He did not apologize easily, but he stopped dismissing my experience. That shift, while small, was real. Mark remained distant. I accepted that distance without trying to close it. Not every relationship was meant to be repaired. Some were meant to be understood and released. One afternoon, I received an email from a local community center asking if I would be willing to share resources about advance directives at a small workshop. The request startled me. I was not an expert. I was simply someone who had learned the hard way. I agreed anyway on the condition that I could keep it practical and anonymous. Standing in front of a small group weeks later, explaining paperwork that most people avoided, I felt grounded rather than exposed. I told them what I wished someone had told me. Do not assume love equals preparedness. Do not wait for a crisis to decide who speaks for you. The nods in the room told me the message was landing. Afterward, a woman older than my parents thanked me with tears in her eyes. She said she had always believed being strong meant not asking for help. Hearing that echoed back across generations made something inside me settle. This was bigger than my family. Back home that evening, I sat quietly and reflected on how far I had come. The anger had softened into discernment. The grief had transformed into acceptance. I no longer needed my parents to fully understand in order to move forward. I needed them to respect the boundaries I had set. Whether they did or not would determine the shape of our relationship, not my worth. That realization felt like freedom. I opened my notes app one last time and reread the first entry I had written in the hospital, raw and shaking. Then I added a final line beneath it. I survived. I chose myself. And I built a life that does not require abandonment to function. I closed the app and set the phone aside. Outside, the evening hummed with ordinary life. Cars passed, neighbors talked. Somewhere, a party was probably happening. This time, I did not feel left behind. I felt exactly where I needed to be. The story did not end with reconciliation or rupture. It ended with something quieter and far more permanent: choice. Months later, when the memory of pain had dulled and the urgency of crisis had passed, I noticed how different my life felt in ordinary moments. Mornings no longer began with a low level of anxiety about who might need something from me. Evenings were not spent rehearsing conversations or anticipating disappointment. My nervous system had learned a new baseline. Calm was no longer something I earned after surviving chaos. It was the default. My relationship with my parents settled into a careful, defined shape. We spoke occasionally. We met in public places. They asked before assuming. They no longer framed my independence as proof I did not need care. When old habits surfaced, I named them without anger and without apology. Sometimes they adjusted, sometimes they did not. Either way, I no longer bent myself to absorb the impact. Mark remained on the periphery of my life, a reminder that fairness often feels like loss to those who benefited from imbalance. I stopped interpreting his silence as rejection. It was simply information. Work stabilized, friendships deepened. I built routines that honored my limits and protected my time. I kept my medical paperwork updated and talked openly with people I trusted about expectations, not because I was afraid, but because I was prepared. Preparation had become an act of self-respect rather than paranoia. Occasionally, someone would mention my post saying it had stayed with them, that it had prompted a hard conversation or a quiet decision. I listened grateful, but detached. The story no longer defined me. It had done its work. One afternoon, while sorting old files, I found a copy of the original consent form from the hospital. My mother's name was printed neatly on the page, a snapshot of who I had trusted by default. I did not tear it up. I did not feel anger. I simply filed it away as a record of who I had been then. Someone who believed love would show up when needed. Someone who had not yet learned that hope without preparation is a gamble. That version of me deserved compassion, not judgment. That night, as I sat on my couch watching the city lights flicker on outside the window, I thought about the question that had followed me since the hospital. If the people who say they love you only show up when the world is watching, is that love or fear of exposure? I finally had an answer that felt settled. It is neither enough. Love that requires silence to survive is not love that keeps you safe. I did not need my parents to become villains to justify my boundaries. I did not need a dramatic ending to validate my choices. The truth was simpler and stronger than that. I had faced a moment where everything was stripped down to essentials. Who stays? Who decides? Who bears the cost? The consent form changed everything because it forced clarity where there had only been assumptions. But the real change came after, in the weeks and months when I chose not to return to the old script. When I let consequences exist without rushing to clean them up. When I allowed myself to be supported without earning it through endurance. If there is one thing I would tell anyone listening to this story, it is this: Do not wait for a crisis to learn where you stand. Decide now who gets access to your body, your time, your truth. Write it down. Say it out loud. Protect it. And if someone walks away when you need them most, believe what that tells you. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. I survived surgery. I survived the fallout. But more importantly, I survived the lie that strength means suffering quietly. I am not strong because I endured abandonment. I am strong because I refused to normalize it, and that is the ending I chose.